Hi, happy Friday and happy Lunar New Year to those who celebrate it. Thank you so much for being here this evening or watching it later if that's the case. I'm Lorraine. I am one of the staff for Claremont Christian Fellowship. So glad you're here with us for Friday Fellowship. I hope tonight's meeting helps you in some way. To begin, let's take a few moments to be silent and to center ourselves on God.
Hello everyone, happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is David Kim and I'm a sophomore at CMC, and I want to welcome all of you to another Friday Fellowship. If this is your first Friday Fellowship, welcome. We're so happy to have you here to learn a little bit more about CCF and to have you as part of our community. Before we get into Jaira's message tonight, just a couple of announcements. To start off, immediately after our Friday Fellowship tonight, we'll be having our virtual Zoom hangout, where we'll be hanging out and maybe playing a few games as a community. You can find all the Zoom links in our messenger chat. We hope to see you there. For our next announcement, we'll be having another awesome Zoom hangout with CCF alum and Pomona Pitzer football coach Matt tomorrow at 10 a.m. Come to get a solid workout and spend some time with awesome people. For a final announcement, next week's Friday Fellowship will be the last message of our series, Bible and Theology. Chris Harry will speak on why are there four Gospels and why are they different. You definitely won't want to miss it. And with those announcements, we'll now hand it off to Chris to introduce tonight's speaker, Jaira Koh.
Hey everyone, it's great to see you. I'm glad you're here or watching later. And I'm really excited for our speaker tonight. I'm very excited that for the first time in quite a while, it's not me. Maybe you're excited about that too. But we have the privilege tonight to hear from Jaira Koh. Jaira is a Pomona College and CCF alum. He graduated in 2017 and then stuck around with us for a year as a CCF intern. Jaira is incredibly smart and a very thoughtful person who thinks deeply about a wide range of issues. You're going to see that come through in his message tonight for sure. He cares a lot about people. He cares a lot about justice. And he's someone who puts his beliefs into meaningful action, a person that I really respect for his integrity. He's currently working on a Master of Divinity degree at Boston University, and we're really grateful to have him. I'm going to bring him on here right now alongside me. So, hey, Jaira, it's great to see you and have you with us. And thank you for taking time out. You're at 9:00 where you are right now. Is that right? Yeah. Well, we appreciate you putting in a Friday evening here with us instead of whatever you'd be doing to relax right now.
Thanks for having me. It's great. It's good to be back.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna hand over to you now, and I'll bring up your slides.
Cool. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me at Friday Fellowship. I'm really excited to be, back with CCF, even if virtually, and I'm very excited about our topic for tonight. I want to start with just a quick personal introduction to kind of add to what Chris has said. That'll I hope will helpfully frame how I'm approaching this talk, and hopefully also make it feel a little bit more like there's a real person on the other side of your internet connection, since most of you won't have met me before. So yeah, I'm Jaira, and as an undergrad at Pomona College, I was really involved with CCF, which was where I first encountered the term liberation theology, even though I can't really remember where or when exactly I heard it. And maybe this describes where you are right now. You've heard of liberation theology, but you have no idea what it is. Maybe the word liberation sounds exciting, maybe a little dangerous even. Maybe the idea of having a prefix to theology is strange and counterintuitive. I remember when I was still in Claremont and first dipped my toes into reading a couple of books that describe themselves as a liberation theology of some kind or another, and feeling totally thrown, wondering, is this allowed? Can people write or say this and call it theology? So maybe that describes you too. You've taken a crack at the material and don't know what to do with the information you've found or where to turn to make sense of it. So I'm currently in my last semester of a theology graduate program in Boston. And after taking a 2-semester class that contextualized liberation theology within the broader arc of the development of Christian theology, and then another class explicitly called Theologies of Liberation, now being just weeks away from being officially dubbed a Master of Divinity, I'm qualified to tell you that when it comes to liberation theology, I mostly know what I don't know. So outside of school, the other hat I wear is that of a tenant organizer. So basically trying to build unions of tenants, the way you might build labor unions, but more informal. And in the work of trying to help people who are fighting to stay in their homes during the pandemic, to get their heating up and running when the temperature goes below zero, and more broadly, to abolish the housing market, I think I've also got some qualification to tell you that liberation theologies have sustained me when the work feels like it's too much to handle, too tiring to bear. So on that note, I want to share what's probably my favorite fragment of liberation theology with you. This is from James Cone's A Black Theology of Liberation, a text we'll be spending quite some time with tonight. Black theology, responding to the Black condition, takes on the character of rebellion against things as they are. In the writings of Camus, the rebel is the one who refuses to accept the absurd condition of things, but fights against them in spite of the impossibility of arriving at a solution. In Black theology, Blacks are encouraged to revolt against the structures of white social and political power by affirming Blackness, but not because Blacks have a chance of winning. What could the concept of winning possibly mean? Blacks do what they do because and only because they can do no other. And Black theology says simply that such action is in harmony with divine revelation. I'm about to make us do some hard work on a Friday night, 9 p.m. my time, as Chris has mentioned. So, in sharing this quote early on, I wanted to give you all a little taste of what we're working for, what's on the other side, why this is worth doing, before we plunge into it proper. And so with this quote from James Cone, this is what liberation theology is capable of saying. And my hope is that through this talk, we'll be able to revisit this quote, this instance of liberation theology, and be able to engage with it more deeply after having done a little bit more groundwork. So considering these very dubious credentials of mine, what am I trying to do with this talk? I'm hoping to give you a sense of how specific and historical of a phenomenon liberation theology is, and at the same time a sense of how abstract and wide-ranging it is, so that you can be equipped and motivated to do your own exploration, an exploration that involves theory and practice alike, and not apart. Because this is a core tension within Theologies of Liberation. In the spirit of this, I'm going to try and get us to do liberation theology even as I introduce liberation theology. So in a bit, I'm going to put a short prompt up on the screen and ask everyone to take a minute to think of a recent example of something that describes, that's described by those prompts from your own life, something that you've done, or maybe that you've seen or you've heard about in the world around you that was compelling to you. So yeah, these are the 4 things. So think of something that fits the bill, fits this description. The liberating transformation of the history of humankind. The process through which the world is transformed. The protest against trampled human dignity. And the struggle against the plunder of the vast majority of humankind in liberating love and in the building of a new, just, and comradely society. Okay, so I'm going to give everyone, just a minute or so to think about that, and because I think it'll be important to have that in your head as this goes. Okay, hopefully that was enough time. If not, don't worry. It doesn't have to be a perfect example. It's not going to tick off all the boxes. You're not committed to it. This is just something. I think it's important to have this kind of personal reflection going on and bring parts of your life into the talk as we're going into it. Okay, so fantastic. Now we can actually get into some liberation theology. We're going to go back in time. We're going to hit the ground running because liberation theology was born in a very wild time. In 1970, James Cone published A Black Theology of Liberation while teaching at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. That's James Cone on the slide, and that's his book. A year later, and without any coordination with Cone or knowledge of what he'd written, Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian priest, published Teología de la Liberación, or A Theology of Liberation. Gutierrez had returned a few years earlier from theological study in Europe to confront anew the poverty in his continent that he'd grown up in. Now, I don't want to belabor this point unnecessarily, but keep in mind, this was 50 years ago. There just wasn't any sort of rapid-fire communication taking place between Cone and Gutierrez at this point. Academic Twitter was not a thing. The timing, therefore, is something of a miracle to me. Some of us would say this was the work of God inspiring adjacent but not identical theological works, basically simultaneously. Some of us would say that this was just a natural product of the radicalism of the late 60s, that liberation talk was thick in the air. So of course it started showing up in theology. Some of us would say that the two are one and the same thing. So in a sense, we're starting today with words, very specific words. If we're here to talk about theologies of liberation, then we want to start with when the phrase liberation theology starts circulating in the discourse. So of course, there's not really a singular point or even, one or two specific points with Gutierrez's and Cone's books. And there's many other things that you could argue from the years before as, maybe the literal first emergence of liberation theology as a word. But in terms of how it starts getting used popularly and forms a theological movement of its own, I think it's helpful to think of these two theological events happening in North and South America at roughly the same time. And it's accurate and I think it's honest, even if maybe it's not the most precise definition that we can get. And when we're thinking about this time period and getting specific about the people of Gutierrez and Cone, then we're not just talking about words, we're talking about action. What is unfolding around James Cone is the Black Power movement, with the Black Panther Party arguably at the height of its powers in 1970, in the wake of the success of its independent newspaper and social programs like the Free Breakfast Program, which I think a lot of us have heard about. And this is right before the FBI would really, send its campaign to destroy the Panthers into overdrive over the next decade. And what about Gutierrez? He was a close collaborator with a figure that many of us are familiar with, Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian educator behind the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was in turn a huge influence on bell hooks, so I think many of us have heard about or read. Paulo Freire was involved in mass literacy campaigns amongst rural peasants in Brazil, which aren't exactly like the kind of literacy programs you might imagine if you've not heard of them. The pedagogical approach that Freire developed, which again was something he was working on with Gutierrez as Gutierrez was writing A Theology of Liberation, was very anti-hierarchical. It was very participatory and politicized. The volunteers in the literacy program would spend some time in the peasant community where they were going to be facilitating the program, and take days, weeks to take notes on what the key words for people's lives were. The words and the concept they were actually already using on a day-to-day basis. What happened then was they'd get folks in a room and throw up a picture or a symbol of one of those words, and then have everyone discuss their understanding of that symbol. Volunteers and peasants alike, teachers and students alike. They put a picture of, for example, maybe of one of those houses that the peasants have to work to build, and get people to talk about their understanding of that image to flesh it out. And they'd ask politicized questions. For example, who builds those houses? But then who owns those houses? And who gets to live in those houses? And why is it that way? And only after that full discussion was exhausted would a volunteer finally write the actual word for that symbol next to the image, such that the image would now be associated with the fuller set of meanings and contain this more complex, really localized understanding of what the word really means in that community. So a house in this case isn't just the dictionary definition of a building for someone to live in. Houses are more often than not buildings that the many poor build, but that the few wealthy get to own and live in or rent out and police maintain those relationships of property with their guns. So, okay, don't worry, I'm not just here to rattle off a half-baked history of the birth of liberation theology. I'm not going to put you all through that tonight. But I think the particular history is important because in many ways, it's actually central to the theology itself. Let's now look at Gustavo Gutierrez's own definition of what liberation theology is. Theology as critical reflection on historical praxis is a liberating theology, a theology of the liberating transformation of the history of humankind, and also, therefore, that part of humankind gathered into ecclesia, which openly confesses Christ. Quick note, just because this is a confusing sentence, Gutierrez is saying that this liberating transformation will also transform those of us who openly confess Christ. Let me continue. This is a theology which does not stop with reflecting on the world, but rather tries to be part of the process through which the world is transformed. It is a theology which is open in the protest against trampled human dignity, in the struggle against the plunder of the vast majority of humankind, in liberating love, and in the building of a new just and comradely society to the gift of the kingdom of God. So this probably looks familiar, a lot of the language from here, from the prompt I put up at the start of the talk. But if you recall, when I first put this quote up, or the bits from it, I omitted everything in the quote that mentions theology. That is, what I had us do was think about historical praxis. But the theology bit, it really is contained within the critical reflection on historical praxis. For Gutierrez, that reflection has to be following and in response to historical praxis. So in a sense, you could say that theology is just words, thoughts that follow, respond to, and make sense of action, that then open us up to and lead us to participating in the transformation of the history of humankind. So as a work of theology, Gutierrez's own work has to be understood in the same way, as a reflection upon the Christian praxis he engaged in and saw around him. And what was that praxis? It was work in solidarity with the poor, and the struggles for liberation by the poor, as in the peasant literacy campaigns. I think this is a good place to linger because it's not really an intuitive place to be, at least not to most of us raised Catholic or Protestant. I'll leave the Eastern Orthodox folks out because I think y'all's theological tradition does better on this count than the other Christian ones. This sets theology as at least secondary to, if not necessarily subordinate to, Christian practice. Again, it's a second step in the words of Gutierrez. He says, theology follows. It is the second step. What Hegel, the German philosopher, used to say about philosophy can likewise be applied to theology. It rises only at sundown. The pastoral activity of the church does not flow as a conclusion from theological premises. Theology does not produce pastoral activity. Rather, it reflects upon it. Theology must be able to find in pastoral activity the presence of the Spirit inspiring the action of the Christian community. So you'll notice this is not, right action that flows from an origin in right thought, not unilaterally. The reflection and work of theology, that is, by definition, the definition of theology, talking about God, follows action. But then the movement from practice to theory is also not unilateral or even truly separated either for Gutierrez. They move in a circular manner, with the reflection of theology sharpening and drawing us back to praxis that you can reflect on anew, and so on and so forth in a circle over and over. So we've now got a pretty good theoretical explanation for what Gutierrez understands theology is. What does theology actually look like for him, though? Gutierrez actually gives it to us in this beautiful passage. Starting from Christian praxis, commitment, and prayer, theology seeks to provide a language for speaking about God. It deals with a faith that is inseparable from the concrete conditions in which the vast majority, and in a sense, even all the inhabitants of Latin America live. Among us, the great pastoral and therefore theological question is, how is it possible to tell the poor, who are forced to live in conditions that embody a denial of love, that God loves them? This is equivalent to asking, how can we find a way of talking about God amid the suffering and oppression that is the experience of the Latin American poor? Let's break this down a little bit. So you've got here a definition for theology. It's a language for speaking about God. So that's a helpful piece to hold on to. But this language emerges from participation in a material reality, the conditions of poverty that Gutierrez found all around him. That shapes his language for speaking about God. It is precisely his close engagement with the conditions of poverty that force him to ask the questions that he asks. The theological question most at hand for Gutierrez is not, how does the Trinity work or what is free will? It is, how is it possible to tell the poor, who are forced to live in conditions that embody a denial of love, that God loves them? This is the most urgent, immediate problem confronting God talk, theology, for Gutierrez. In a way, we're not exactly starting at Gutierrez's step one. We're arriving somewhere in the middle of one of the circular motions of theology because Gutierrez has already presupposed that God loves the poor. He takes that for granted. But his theological reflection, so where the theology of liberation theology comes in here, is on the conditions of unlove around him that demand a different way of talking about God because the usual words for God's love don't seem up to the task. Okay, I'm hoping everyone's still with me. We've done quite a lot of work, but we've got a bit more to do. We're going to turn back to James Cone and his Black Theology of Liberation because he also presents a real challenge to the way theology was normally done and is normally done. And he makes that challenge quite explicit and easy to follow, I think, even if a little hard to swallow. So early on in A Black Theology of Liberation, James Cone really digs into the sources and norm for theology. The sources are the inputs that give you the character of a given theology, whereas the norm is the criterion that you subject those sources to. As he says, the sources are the relevant data for the theological task, whereas the norm determines how the data will be used. So I'm going to pause again to just give you a minute to reflect. What are the sources that you draw from for your theology? What is the norm that you measure those sources against? Again, I don't want us to worry about getting it exactly right or having the best answer to this. I just want us to start involving our own lives, our own theological sources and values as we do this and hear the rest of this talk. And to start making the stuff that's actually already at work behind the scenes in our theology, in our lives, get that stuff to have a little bit of time in the sun. So maybe just take a minute or so to think about this. What are the norms and sources for your theology in your life? Okay, hopefully that's enough time for everyone. Again, doesn't have to be a perfect answer. Let's just try to keep that reflecting as we go through the talk. Let's now see what sources and norm Cone names for Black theology. So in his book, he lists Black experience, Black history, Black culture, revelation, scripture, and tradition. Now, Cone leading with Black experience, history, and culture is breaking new ground theologically at this time, and certainly is doing so as a work of theology that's produced inside of the academy. I'm not going to try to cover all this ground here because it's a very fascinating whole chapter of his book. But I want to point out that Cone considers all of these elements interdependent and that they're not in order of priority. That being said, the very fact that he considers elements of Black life a source for his theology on par with revelation, scripture and tradition, indicates that even when it comes to those more classical sources for theology, he's about to do something very different. And he does. For Cone, revelation, as in the resurrection of Jesus, means that Jesus is present in the midst of all societies, effecting his liberation of the oppressed. He is not confined to the first century, and thus our talk of him in the past is important only insofar as it leads us to an encounter with him now. Scripture is the biblical witness that God is a God of liberation, who speaks to the oppressed and the abused. Tradition is first and foremost that of the Black church in the US, founded on the belief that God condemned slavery and that Christian freedom meant political emancipation, concerned only with the tradition of Christianity that is usable in the Black liberation struggle. So you can start to see from Kohn's sources for his theology kind of a shape to his theological norm, the tool he evaluates those sources by. What is the norm? This is Kohn's words. What is the norm of Black theology? The norm of all God talk, which is theology, God talk is theology, which seeks to be Black talk, is the manifestation of Jesus as the Black Christ, who provides the necessary soul for Black liberation. Black theology refuses to accept any norm which does not focus on Jesus Christ, because he is the essence of the Christian gospel. But when we speak of the Christian gospel, we have merely scratched the surface by saying Jesus is at its center. It is so easy to make his name mean intellectual analysis, and we already have too much of that garbage in seminary libraries. What is needed is an application of the name to concrete human affairs. What does the name mean when Black people are burning buildings and white people are responding with riot police control? Whose side is Jesus on? The norm of Black theology, which identifies revelation as a manifestation of the Black Christ, says that he is those very Blacks whom white society shoots and kills. The contemporary Christ is in the Black ghetto, making decisions about white existence and Black liberation. Of course, this interpretation of theology will seem strange to most whites, and even some Blacks will wonder whether it is really true that Christ is Black. But the truth of the statement is not dependent on white or Black affirmation, but on the reality of Christ himself, who is presently breaking the power of white racism. This and this alone is the norm for Black talk about God. So I think we're ready to return to the quote that I shared at the start of the talk and maybe reconsider it in light of the work we've done tonight. So let me read it again. In Black theology, Blacks are encouraged to revolt against the structures of white social and political power by affirming Blackness, but not because Blacks have a chance of winning. What could the concept of winning possibly mean? Blacks do what they do because and only because they can do no other. And Black theology says simply that such an action is in harmony with divine revelation. So first of all, we can definitely spot a resonance with Gustavo Gutierrez's second step idea. The role of Black theology here is to reflect on the work that Black people are already doing because they can do no other, and find ways to say simply that such action is in harmony with divine revelation. Second, you can see the importance of Kohn's norm for Black theology, which is the reality of Christ himself, who is presently breaking the power of white racism. This is why Kohn can talk about revolting against whiteness without any guarantee of winning, or even knowing what winning would look like. Because if this is where the revealed Christ is working, then that's the work to be done. Winning be damned. So why do we have to get so specific with liberation theology? Why all this time on Kohn and Gutierrez, just these two men and the historical origin of the term with their books? What does all this theological history have to do with you? I think this level of specificity is important because in one sense, liberation theology is just words that anyone can decide to use for whatever purpose to whatever ends. There aren't real gatekeepers to the term. Maybe if you write a paper on it and try to call something ridiculous a liberation theology, your professor will criticize that and give you a bad grade. But outside of the classroom, there's not really some authority that's going to decide this is a liberation theology, that's not, this is the right way of doing it, and that's wrong. And this is especially so because liberation theology, as we saw, was historically born as a response to the ways of doing theology that were sanctioned by religious institutions and authorities. And it's a rejection of that authority. So am I then saying that anything goes in liberation theology? In a practical sense, yes, no one's stopping you. But there are implications and consequences to the choices that we make. And I'm not saying this in a sort of, watch out for this Pandora's box, you'd better follow the rules even when no one's watching because it's dangerous. I'm saying this in the sense that if we're using liberation theology uncritically, we're missing out on so much that's happening inside of liberation theology, but also inside of us. Put another way, if there's something about liberation theology that calls to you, responding with reflection is an opportunity to notice what God is doing around you and in you. And I think something has already called out to you from these words. Why else would you be listening to a video talk on a Friday evening in the Zoom era? If you're still here, it's because those words, liberation theology, matter to you in some way. Tonight, what you've really heard about is why liberation theology matters to me in particular, and I'm hoping that that can set you up to explore why it matters enough to you that you've made it a priority tonight. Or maybe you don't get the hype, but you care about this community, and that's really the only reason why you're here. I think there's still something to grapple with there. Why do people in this community care about this stuff? What compelled them to want to have a talk on this topic? Why might that be different for you? I think that's the start of a conversation with others, but also with yourself. If there's something about liberation theology that calls to the people around you, people you care about, to yourself, then responding with reflection is an opportunity to notice what God is doing in them and around them as well. And I think it's really important to note that those are probably going to be different things, even if the differences are subtle, even if the differences are the kind of differences between Gutierrez's work and Kohn's work, because those aren't the same theologies. Liberation theologians disagree with each other all the time. Womanist theology, for one example, is in some ways an explicit critique by Kohn's previous PhD students of Kohn's inattention to the lives and wisdom of Black women, of a kind of masculinist martyr complex to his work. So this is an invitation to ask, what is it about liberation theology that calls out to me specifically? Or conversely, what is my response to this liberation theology tell me about who I am and what I care about? What is the praxis around you that invites reflection? What do you care about? What draws you to liberation theology? What do you mean when you say liberation theology? What are the sources and norms of your theology? This is an invitation to realize that you have always had the capacity to be a theologian, that you have always been a theologian, whether you're conscious of it or not. And this is an invitation to claim that theological power and to recognize that everyone around you has that same power as well. I want to emphasize here that I'm not giving you more homework. At least I'm not giving you more readings unless you really want to do more reading. If I can invoke Gutierrez once again, theology is a second step following Christian praxis. This is something to be worked out and reflected upon, not just read about. I know CCF is in the midst of a series on the Bible and theology, and so I think it bears saying that even though the focus of tonight has been on liberation theology, a lot of the kind of hard methodological work that we've done actually applies to theology in general. So we got really extremely specific about the origins and qualities of two liberation theologies and two theologians in particular, in the hopes that it would be clear that liberation theology isn't only an abstract generalizable idea, that there has never been one liberation theology, and further that liberation theologies are always concrete historical products. The same is true of theology, even theology that goes without a qualifying prefix. Regular theology, it's a historical fact that Christians have always had theologies and disagreements. And the challenge tonight has been to start thinking about where you fit into that context. And I hope that the other side to this talk has been to empower you to take on that challenge in practice and in reflection. So hopefully that's what happened. Equipped in this way, I want to end by giving you a taste of other theologies of liberation, to hint at the wide, beautiful world of liberation theology that has come to life since Gutierrez and Kohn, that I'm hoping that this talk will have made more exciting and less intimidating. I'll just give some background to explain each quote, but I won't analyze them. I'll leave that for your exploration. So first, this is from a textbook introducing various theologies of liberation, and it's from Sharon Betcher, that's her on the slide, her chapter on liberative theologies of disability. When ultimate reality, heaven, or prelapsarian Eden, that is Eden before Adam and Eve got kicked out, is imagined as a realm without pain, tears, suffering, although Christians proclaim a God who has emptied God's self into this world without transcendental reserve and who has intimately shared with us the pain passages of the world, then bodies of persons with disabilities are seen as but a visitation of pain. A reminder is in order that earlier stages of Christian theology shaped Western biology and medicine, which assumes suffering as inherently a diminution of life, as if pleasure and pain were opposed and we must eradicate pain in order to have a life of meaning. So that's one. This next one is from the introduction to Chung Hyun-kyung's Struggle to be the Sun Again, a very wide-ranging survey of feminist theologies that were at the time emerging in Asia. Chung found out during her PhD program that she had actually been gestated by a surrogate, a poor woman whose existence had been almost completely silenced by the family that actually raised Chung. So this is from her intro. When I first went to meet my birth mother and listen to the stories of her hard life's journey, I felt that something in my deepest being was broken open. It was like the experience of baptism. Something was washed away and I felt truly free. Through this ill 72-year-old woman, my mother, I felt that I was encountering the power of the despised in my people's history. Hyun-kyung, I said to myself, you have studied theology for more than 11 years. For whom have you done your theology? You always thought you studied theology in order to empower the oppressed people in your country. But face it, have you really paid attention to the culture and history of the poor in the development of your theology? Have you been willing to learn from them? We Asian women must trust our own feelings and judgments and use them to challenge the established norms which designate what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. Our concrete, historical, everyday lived experiences must serve as the final test of our theology. If a religious teaching or practice provides a life-giving power to Asian women so that we can sustain and liberate our lives, that teaching and practice becomes good news, gospel for us. If it makes Asian women die both inside and out, it becomes bad news. And last but certainly not least, here are the sensational opening paragraphs to Indecent Theology, a book by Marcella Althaus-Reid. That's Althaus-Reid on the right, her book on the left. Should a woman keep her pants on in the streets or not? Shall she remove them, say, at the moment of going to church, for a more intimate reminder of her sexuality in relation to God? What difference does it make if that woman is a lemon vendor and sells you lemons in the streets without using underwear? Moreover, what difference would it make if she sits down to write theology without underwear? The Argentinian woman theologian and the lemon vendors may have some things in common and others not. In common, they have centuries of patriarchal oppression in the Latin American mixture of clericalism, militarism, and the authoritarianism of decency. That is, the sexual organization of the public and private spaces of society. However, there may be differences too. The lemon vendor sitting in the street may be able to feel her sex. Her musky smell may be confused with that of her basket of lemons, in a metaphor that brings together sexuality and economics. But the Argentinian theologian may be different. She may keep her underwear on at the moment of prayer, or whilst reflecting on salvation, and maybe the smell of her sex doesn't get mixed in with issues of theology and economy. Writing theology without underwear may be punishable by law, who knows? An act of gross indecency, such as that of the prostitute woman described by the Mexican novelist Josefina Estrada, seems to be, in the words of the policeman, an action against the moral order of the country. Yet an Argentinian feminist theologian may want to do precisely that. Her task may be to deconstruct a moral order which is based on a heterosexual construction of reality, which organizes not only categories of approved social and divine interactions, but of economic ones too. The Argentinian theologian would like then to remove her underwear to write theology with feminist honesty, not forgetting what it is to be a woman when dealing with theological and political categories. I should call such a theologian indecent, and her reflection, indecent theology. We've taken a few first steps together today. I'll just leave you with my invitation to take the second step. Thank you.
Jaira, thank you so much. We really appreciate the message. As usual with you, I feel like we're getting this tip of the iceberg, that you've done a tremendous amount of thinking and reading on our behalf, and that we're getting this very tantalizing distillation of all the thought behind it. I'm finding it very helpful and challenging as I think about it. And I'm guessing that other folks here are too. So is it okay if after a moment of response that we come back and maybe make room for some questions?
That'll be great. I love that.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to let you go for a second here, and then I'll bring you back in a few minutes. All right, so that goes out to all of you. We're going to do a response song piece right now. And as we do that, feel free to post any questions that you have for Jaira that you'd like him to get into. Remember that he was a Claremont student, and a lot of this, the beginning of this formation for him happened in Claremont. So they could be either questions about his current thought or issues that are on your mind, or it could be related back to his process of thinking through these issues and what resources were helpful for him as a student. So I invite you to consider any of those things. I've just pulled in this song. We just got a corrected version of it. There was a technical issue before, and I'm hoping it works well. So we're going to find out as I bring it in right now. And let's respond together.
I come before you just as I am. I lay me at your feet. I bring before you all that I have and lay it at your feet. You are worthy, 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 Lord. You are worthy, 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 so praise like oil. For you I pour it out. For you I pour it out. I pour it out for you. Praise like oil. For you I pour it out. For you I pour it out. I pour it out for you. Pour this perfume, not to impress the people standing around. Oh, pour this perfume, 'cause of your worthiness is uphold now. You are worthy, 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 Lord. You are worthy, 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 so praise like oil. For you I pour it out. For you I pour it out. I pour it out for you. Praise like oil. For you I pour it out. For you I pour it out. I pour it out for you. Oh, it's foolishness, I know. And your foolishness is wiser than my wisest. Wiser, wiser. It's foolishness, I know. And your foolishness is wiser than my wisest. Wiser, wiser.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was, some folks mentioned in the comments, but Daniel Park put that together for us, and he got Jeremy Taylor to bring in the vocals there. So really a treat to have them. This is like some old school CCF. Both of them were close with Jaira from Jaira's time back on campus. So I'm going to bring Jaira back in here if you're, oh, I think we might have lost Jaira from the feed. So let's see if he can get back on the feed somehow here, and then we can take some questions. I'm going to give him a second to do that. And actually, let's see. I don't know if we'll get him back so easily. So what I might do then is I might invite him, unless he pops on before we finish up here. I might. Oh wait, no, I see him. Sorry, I know exactly what happened. There he is. Okay, I'm bringing him on right now. Let's see. Sorry about that, Jaira. I in the process of bringing on that other video, I lost track of you on my control panel here. So anyway, we're back. Okay. Well, let's see. I wanted to kick off with one question for you, and it's kind of related to what I was asking before, or mentioning before, which is you reformed so much during your time at college and then afterward. And I wonder if you could share like a couple of ways that maybe that were helpful for you in your formation that maybe students today could also take enter into if they wanted to.
Sure. Like, what was? You're asking more about like kind of.
I'm thinking like books or classes or professors or experiences. If there's any top ones that you might suggest as this worked for me.
Yeah. I think. Let's see. I think the main thing would be. I think when you're like starting out, I mean, I just grabbed whatever I could find. The Claremont, like the library of the Claremont colleges has a pretty decent range of like theology books, all things considered, especially when it comes to like liberation theologies, because I think there's a bit more of an overlap with the academy, like the broader university. So in some ways, like I think just exploring and trying to give stuff a shot and reading it and seeing what's out there was helpful. And I think that was like helped in large part by like not feeling like I don't know that was bad or off limits in any sort of way. Like that the Christian community I had, even if we didn't like necessarily think the same things or talk about the same things, like it wasn't weirding anybody out that I was reading other things. I think that helps because the material I think can initially feel like so horizon broadening that you're like it's kind of easy to get to feel a little bit unmoored. And I think on a similar note, the professor that I found most helpful, which I didn't expect to be a class that was like helping me figure out how I thought about my faith and Christianity, was the class I took with Professor Phyllis Jackson. So she talks a lot about like how you think about texts and reading art, and I think a lot of that has shaped how I think about scripture, like theological texts in general, and that's been really helpful. I think lots of work to make that transition, but lots of tools at the same time.
Thank you, Jaira, and appreciate the work that you've done and sharing that with us. I have a question I'm going to post here from Sigrika. I'll bring it up on the screen if it fits. It reads, how does one navigate mainstream Western Christian spaces with a liberationist perspective? I feel like it is easy to get jaded and exhausted with constant reminders of the harmful institutions perpetuated by the church.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll be completely honest. I feel like in a lot of ways, I don't really want to hang out in mainstream Western Christian spaces. I think in a lot of ways, yeah, it does kind of get frustrating. And I think I would say like the way that makes the most sense to me is to, I think for me, it becomes like most doable or most hopeful when we kind of have like let's see, it's like there's like a work, like an external facing work that's not only internal facing towards the church, if that makes sense. Because you'll still have to be doing all the same kinds of like, internal critique of how you're doing things and not perpetuating the harmful institutions. But if there's like a common like work, I'm thinking of the kinds of work that Gutierrez and company were doing, like, work facing the poor, work facing oppressed peoples that I think give you something to direct your energy towards. And yeah, I think it can get really frustrating if you're trying to figure out how to not perpetuate harmful institutions of the church while just staying inside church, if that makes sense. It kind of feels like you end up spending so much energy on I don't know, kind of just trying to do better. I feel like how to say this confusingly. Like, yeah, it feels like it can often feel like you're like trying to work on or like improve kind of the very thing that'll like make you feel the same way again the next time. And so it feels a little bit of like a 2-step forward, 1-step back kind of a thing. But I think if there's something external facing, you still have to do the same work, but there's I think you get more encouragement, or like you can see it going in a different direction. Sorry, hopefully that's useful.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate what you're saying too about it's like it is a very different space to be in the mainstream church from actually being in the places that are challenging us and forcing us to grow. And I would say for some of you all out there who feel kind of caught in like, it's like, especially if you feel like you're in a church where I don't know how to be in this space, maybe that's not the space to be in. You know, there's quite a wide variety of churches out there, and sometimes we have no choice about it, and sometimes we may feel called to be in a certain place for a certain reason. But for the most part, like, I mean, there's a church right next to campus, the Claremont United Church of Christ, and they talk about justice every Sunday. So, you know, and there's other churches like that. So we have some choices about the spaces we're in. I really appreciate the word, Jaira, about the like needing to be in the actual places where it's happening and we're being challenged, rather than being in a separate Christian space trying to care about justice. I think I stole some of Raul's thunder here with my question, but I'm going to put this up. How did you first learn about liberation theology, and how have your perspectives on theology been shaped in college and after college? I'm wondering maybe if you can say something about the after college part, and maybe even tell us a little bit about the work you're doing right now with tenant rights and how that's informing your thinking.
Yeah, that's great. I love the question. I honestly don't remember a ton from when I first heard it exactly. I want to say, let's see. I feel like it came up at whether it was like guest speakers, like invited speakers, or you know, people in the community, in the CCF community would make reference to it. In that, I think there's like there's been consistently like a concern for like economic justice and for the poor in CCF. There's always been like an interest in that, I think, in the community. And so it makes sense to me that like liberation theology would come up, because it's, you know, such a core element to it, especially, you know, specifically the Latin American liberation theologians. But I think this is really a big part of why I shaped the talk and thought about it the way I did, was that it kind of always felt like it was floating around me, and I was like, this seems relevant, or this seems related, this seems like a synonym for all these other things that we're saying, but I don't really know what it means. If someone like, yeah, and so I feel like in some ways I was giving a talk that I was kind of like, it would be great to have heard this as a student, in that I wanted to know, yeah, like what really did it mean? Like, what were we talking about when we said that? Is it just like a synonym for economic, like incorporating concern for the poor and economic justice into Christianity? Like, what else does it mean besides that? And so other than, again, unfortunately, I really don't remember when I first heard it, but in encountering the phrase, I said, I'm going to look this up. And so the Claremont College just has a copy of Struggle to be the Sun. That's why I have it. I actually used the scanned copy that I scanned as an undergrad when preparing this talk, because I can't find the book anymore. So I read that, and I read either A Black Theology of Liberation or James Cone's really famous book, Black Theology and Black Power, and they kind of really threw me off. And so that's kind of where that my exploration started. And I think, you know, to say a little bit about what's happened after college, being in grad school was like really helpful in that, I mean, part of the job is to go really slowly and actually have to trace what we're doing with it. And, you know, in that way I was really supported. So it made sense as a next step. I think doing it on your own, it's such a wide world. And if, and it's an academic conversation. it's theologies that are being produced in response to practice, but this is academic theology in a lot of ways. Like James Cone's book was written to stick a finger in the eye of the white theological establishment to say, y'all have not, like, this is not going right. And that's who his audience was. It wasn't, Gutierrez wasn't writing to the people that he was working with. And that was intentional.
So a couple questions I want to kind of pull together here, and they essentially revolve around this idea of maybe we can like talk about what you're doing now a little bit, and this question of how do you put, how can someone put their sort of liberative theology into practice? And so, maybe you can reflect on how that's looked for you, like putting into practice, and then also like how does your faith come into that? So is it something where you just, my faith is just a part of what I do here, and then you kind of just go do it? Or do you try to actively bring your faith into what you do in some way? I don't know, are you thinking about it when you're doing it? Are you talking about it? Or are you keeping more of a distance? So it's a two-parter, right? How do we practice it? And then what does it look like to bring our faith into that practice?
Yeah, great questions. Let's see. So I think in a lot of ways, the key to, and I can talk about myself in a second, but I think I guess the word I'd have for everyone in general is, I think the capacity or the bigness of liberation theology is I'm trying to encourage folks to think about where do you already see liberative practice, like Christian practice, that is compelling to you, that you're a part of, and how do you reflect on that as liberation theology in your life? And so, I'm happy to, and I'll just talk in a sec about what I'm doing, but I think it's key to think about what's already compelling you and what are you already, what are you already part of, or what is already drawing you and that you're already thinking about, that you're already moved by in the world, that you can reflect on as theology. And so for myself, the work I'm most involved in right now is organizing tenants unions, which is like labor unions. You get together with your neighbors, you put a set of demands together for the landlord, and you figure out what you can do to win those demands, whether it's a rally, and anywhere from a rally to a calling campaign to all the way on the other end is a rent strike, like similar to a labor strike where you don't pay your rent altogether. And the way I see my faith in that is, I think, I don't explicitly bring it, certainly not conversationally, but so the reason why I put that James Cone quote up at the start about what will winning even look like is the work is really hard. It's very, it's a grind. It's very slow. It's very discouraging. I think we're trying to do something, especially in the work that I'm involved in particular. We're trying to take on work that the state isn't interested in doing, that nonprofits don't do, so that it's entirely on a volunteer basis. And so it feels oftentimes impossible, like we're not going to win, and we are facing up against often like the biggest corporate landlords that in a lot of ways run local cities. And so when the odds are like that, I think you need something to draw on. If you're just going on like willpower, you're going to hit a wall and you'll burn out and you'll get, cynical and disillusioned. And I think for me, that's been the core of, I think liberation theology, I think offers me an understanding of what I'm doing as part of a really like grand historical theological narrative of God at work across millennia, whether it's like in solidarity with the 16th century diggers who were like fighting the enclosure movement in the UK, or like ancient slave rebellions. Like this is the same work of Christ, like across time. And it's not about winning for me. Like I think a lot of people can feel like really hopeless because like feel like you're not able to do anything because you don't have hope. But I think what Cone does for me is he kind of separates the need to struggle in solidarity from a need to win, or that sort of hope, the hope that you're like, it's gonna work. Like, it's not related to that. It's like, this is where, in Cohn's case, the Black Christ is at work. Then you don't get to choose. It's not like you don't do math about it. You don't do calculus. It's just you have to go, and there's like a call, like a compulsion, maybe, like at some level. So I think that's how I see it. It's like, it helps me understand my place in the universe, and in in Christian history, and in the history of the struggle of oppressed peoples.
That's great, Jaira. I think that's really helpful. I was really struck by what you were saying in your message early on with Cohn, and this idea of, or maybe it was Gutierrez actually, this idea that the theology emerges out of the experience of the justice in doing it, and isn't something that we sort of build in isolation and then bring it to it. And something about being in the struggle then forcing you to think differently about God, or in what you're describing right now, even like kind of forcing you to need God in a way that you wouldn't have from an ivory tower academic perspective or something. Really appreciate that. I think that's all the time we probably have for Q&A right now. Sorry, Jeremy, you can ask Jaira your question later, or but we've really enjoyed having you with us, and you don't have to. You're welcome if you want to hop on the Zoom afterward and chat with people, but if you're tired, you're welcome just to go to bed too. If you stay on the stream here, Jaira, and I can pop on after and check in with you about that before.
Sounds good.
But great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciated having you and the time that you've given us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
All right. See you later. All right. Well, I'm going to kick it over to David to close us out.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And thank you so much to Jaira for your awesome message tonight on liberation theology. And thank you all so much for joining tonight's Friday Fellowship. Once again, I invite you all to stick around for tonight's hangout, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.